South Sudan, country located in northeastern Africa. Its rich biodiversity includes lush savannas, swamplands, and rainforests that are home to many species of wildlife. Prior to 2011, South Sudan was part of Sudan, its neighbor to the north. South Sudan's population, predominantly African cultures who tend to adhere to Christian or animist beliefs, was long at odds with Sudan's largely Muslim and Arab northern government. South Sudan's capital is Juba. South Sudan is bounded on the north by Sudan, on the east by Ethiopia, on the south by Kenya, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and on the west by the Central African Republic. South Sudan's vast plains and plateaus are drained by the Nile River and its tributaries. This river system runs from south to north across the entire length of the east-central part of the country. At the heart of the country is a clay plain, the center of which is occupied by an enormous swampy region known as Al-Sud, the Sud. South Sudan is among the poorest and least developed countries in the world. Almost 4/5 of its inhabitants depend on farming or animal husbandry for their livelihoods. The civil war that began in late 2013 severely disrupted the economy of South Sudan. Traditional rain-fed farming of small plots predominates in South Sudan, although mechanized farming techniques are increasingly utilized in some areas, such as in the northern part of the country. South Sudan's main crop is sorghum. Other crops include corn, maize, millet, rice, cassava, manioc, peanuts, ground nuts, sweet potatoes, okra, and coffee. The main subsistence crops are sorghum, corn, and cassava, with smaller amounts of millet and rice being grown in some areas. Peanuts are the primary cash crop. There is a considerable amount of livestock raised in the country, including goats, sheep, and cattle. Some livestock are raised for export, but this sector of the country's economy is underdeveloped. The forests of South Sudan yield hardwood timber, such as mahogany and sant, a type of acacia, and softwoods. Gum arabic, in South Sudan it is called gum Africa, a water-soluble gum obtained from acacia trees and used in the production of adhesives, candy, and pharmaceuticals, is an important agricultural export. The Nile rivers are the main source of fish, especially Nile perch. Most of the catch is consumed locally. There is the potential to increase the amount of fish that is sold at market and the possibility of having enough fish available to export, given proper support and development of the fishing industry. Transportation and storage limitations, however, have hindered such efforts in the past. South Sudan is a landlocked country in East Africa. It is bordered on the north by Sudan, on the east by Ethiopia, on the south by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, and Kenya, and on the west by the Central African Republic. South Sudan's diverse landscape includes vast plains and plateaus, dry and tropical savannas, inland floodplains, and forested mountains. The Nile River system is the defining physical feature of the country, running south to north across its center, which is dominated by a large swamp known as the Sud. South Sudan has a population of 12.7 million. Juba is the capital and largest city. Sudan was occupied by Egypt under the Muhammad Ali dynasty and governed as an Anglo-Egyptian condominium until Sudanese independence in 1956. Following the First Sudanese Civil War, the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region was formed in 1972 and lasted until 1983. A second Sudanese civil war soon broke out in 1983 and ended in 2005 with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Later that year, Southern autonomy was restored when an autonomous government of Southern Sudan was formed. South Sudan became an independent state on July 9, 2011, following 98.8% support for independence in a January 2011 referendum. It is the most recent sovereign state with widespread recognition as of 2025. South Sudan descended into a civil war from 2013 to 2020, enduring rampant human rights abuses, including forced displacement, ethnic massacres, and killings of journalists by various parties. It has since been governed by a coalition formed by leaders of the former warring factions, Salva Kiir Mayardit and Riek Machar. The country continues to recover from the war while experiencing ongoing and systemic ethnic violence. The South Sudanese population is composed mostly of Nilotic peoples spanning a variety of ethnic, tribal, and linguistic groups. It is demographically among the youngest nations in the world, with roughly half its people under 18 years old. The majority of inhabitants adhere to Christianity or various traditional indigenous faiths, with a sizable Muslim minority. South Sudan is a member of the United Nations African Union, East African Community and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. It is one of the least developed countries in the world, ranking second to last in the Human Development Index, ahead of only Somalia, and having the second lowest nominal GDP per capita, after Burundi. The name Sudan is a name given to a geographical region to the south of the Sahara, stretching from Western Africa to Eastern Central Africa. The name derives from the Arabic bilad as Sudan, or the land of the blacks. The term was used by Arab traders and travelers in the region to refer to the various indigenous black African cultures and societies that they encountered. The Nilotic people of South Sudan, the Dinka, Anyuik, Bari, Acholi, Nuer, Shilluk, Kalaji, Arabic Faroug, and others first entered South Sudan sometime before the 10th century, coinciding with the fall of medieval Nubia. From the 15th to the 19th century, tribal migrations, largely from the area of Bahr el Ghazal, brought the Anyuik, Dinka, Nuer and Shilluk to their modern locations in Bahr el Ghazal and the Upper Nile region, while the Acholi and Bari settled in Equatoria. The Zanda, Mundu, Avyukaya, and Baka, who entered South Sudan in the 16th century, established the region's largest state of Equatoria region. The Dinka is the largest, the Nuer the second largest, the Zanda the third largest, and the Bari the fourth largest of South Sudan's ethnic groups. They are found in the Maradai, Yambio, and Tumbura districts in the tropical rainforest belt of western Equatoria, the Adio of Azanda client in Ye, central Equatoria, and western Bahr el Ghazal. In the 18th century, the Avungara Sib rose to power over the rest of Azanda society, a domination that continued into the 20th century. British policies favoring Christian missionaries, such as the Closed District Ordinance of 1922, see History of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and geographical barriers such as the swamplands along the White Nile curtailed the spread of Islam to the south, thus allowing the southern tribes to retain much of their social and cultural heritage, as well as their political and religious institutions. South Sudan has an estimated population of 11 million people in 2023, but, given the lack of a census in several decades, this estimate may be severely distorted. The economy is predominantly rural and relies chiefly on subsistence farming. Around 2005, the economy began a transition from this rural dominance, and urban areas within South Sudan have seen extensive development. Between 9 and January 15, 2011, as a consequence of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the South Sudanese independence referendum was held to determine whether South Sudan should become an independent country, separate from Sudan. Following that, 98.83% of those who took part in the referendum voted for separation or independence. And on January 23, 2011, members of a steering committee on post-independence governing told reporters that upon independence the land would be named the Republic of South Sudan out of familiarity and convenience. Other names that had been considered were Azania, Nile Republic, Kush Republic and even Juwama, a portmanteau for Juba, Wau, and Malakal, three major cities. South Sudan formally became independent from Sudan on July 9, although certain disputes still remained, including the division of oil revenues, as 75% of all the former Sudan's oil reserves are in South Sudan. As of March 2025, the region of Abyei still remains disputed. A separate referendum was to be held in Abyei on whether they want to join Sudan or South Sudan, however, an official referendum was never held. The South Kordofan conflict broke out in June 2011 between the Army of Sudan and the SPLA over the Nuba Mountains. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan became the 54th independent country in Africa, July 9 is now celebrated as Independence Day, a national holiday, and since July 14, 2011, South Sudan is the 193rd member of the United Nations. On July 27, 2011, South Sudan became the 54th country to join the African Union. In September 2011, Google Maps recognized South Sudan as an independent country, after a massive crowdsourcing mapping initiative was launched. In 2011 it was reported that South Sudan was at war with at least 7 armed groups in 9 of its 10 states, with tens of thousands displaced. The fighters accuse the government of plotting to stay in power indefinitely, not fairly representing and supporting all tribal groups while neglecting development in rural areas. The Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, also operates in a wide area that includes South Sudan. Inter-ethnic warfare in some cases predates the War of Independence and is widespread. In December 2011, tribal clashes intensified between the Nuer White Army of the Nuer and the Mul. The White Army warned it would wipe out the Mul and would also fight South Sudanese and UN forces sent to the area around Pyburg. In March 2012, South Sudanese forces seized the Haglig oil fields in lands claimed by both Sudan and South Sudan in the province of South Kordofan after conflict with Sudanese forces in the South Sudanese State of Unity. South Sudan withdrew on March 20, and the Sudanese army entered Haglig 2 days later. The economy of South Sudan is one of the world's most underdeveloped, with South Sudan having little existing infrastructure and the highest maternal mortality and female illiteracy rates in the world as of 2011. South Sudan exports timber to the international market. The region also contains many natural resources such as petroleum, iron ore, copper, chromium ore, zinc, tungsten, mica, silver, gold, diamonds, hardwoods, limestone, and hydropower. The country's economy, as in many other developing countries, is heavily dependent on agriculture. Other than natural resources-based companies, other such organizations include Southern Sudan Beverages Limited, a subsidiary of SAB Miller. South Sudan has applied to join the Commonwealth of Nations, considering that South Sudan was part of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and has 2 republics in the Commonwealth of Nations, Kenya and Uganda, as neighboring countries. There was an interest in joining almost immediately after South Sudan's independence. On 5 September 2013, an article written by analyst Duop Chukwul was published by the US-based South Sudan news agency, SSNA. The writer raised critical questions surrounding what he described as the rise of autocracy within the top leadership of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, and warned of monumental repercussions unless the ruling elites restored the founding principles of the party. Duop also berated the ruling party, arguing that the party has replaced its founding principles with forgotten promises and deceptions. In December 2013, a political power struggle broke out between President Kiir and his former deputy Riek Machar, as the president accused Machar and 10 others of attempting a coup d'état. Fighting broke out, igniting the South Sudanese civil war. Ugandan troops were deployed to fight alongside South Sudanese government forces against the rebels. The United Nations has peacekeepers in the country as part of the United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS. Numerous ceasefires were mediated by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, between the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, and SPLM, in opposition and were subsequently broken. A peace agreement was signed in Ethiopia under threat of United Nations sanctions for both sides in August 2015. Machar returned to Juba in 2016 and was appointed vice president. Following a second breakout of violence in Juba, Machar was replaced as vice president and he fled the country as the conflict erupted again. Rebel infighting has become a major part of the conflict. Rivalry among Dinka factions led by the president and Malong Awan has also led to fighting. In August 2018, another power-sharing agreement came into effect. About 400,000 people are estimated to have been killed in the war, including notable atrocities such as the 2014 Bentiu massacre. Although both men have supporters from across South Sudan's ethnic divides, subsequent fighting has been communal, with rebels targeting members of Kiir's Dinka ethnic group and government soldiers attacking Nuers. More than 4 million people have been displaced, with about 1.8 million of those internally displaced, and about 2.5 million having fled to neighboring countries, especially Uganda and Sudan. On February 20, 2020, Salva Kiir Mayardit and Riek Machar agreed to a peace deal. Further, a national unity government on February 22, 2020, as Machar was sworn in as the first vice president of the country. Despite the official cessation of the civil war, violence between armed militia groups at the community level has continued in the country, according to Yasmin Suka, chair of the Commission of Human Rights in Sudan. The level of violence far exceeds the violence between 2013 and 2019. South Sudan acceded to the Treaty of the East Africa Community on April 15, 2016 and became a full member on August 15, 2016. South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo and Federal Republic of Somalia are the newest members of the East African Community. The first democratic elections in South Sudan since the start of the civil war were scheduled for 2023 by the peace agreement that ended the war officially, but the transitional government and opposition agreed in 2022 to move them to late 2024 instead. In September 2024, Kiir's office announced that the elections would be postponed an additional 2 years, to December 2026. South Sudan's protected area of Bandingilo National Park hosts the second largest wildlife migration in the world. Surveys have revealed that Boma National Park, west of the Ethiopian border, as well as the Sud Wetland and Southern National Park near the border with Congo, provided habitat for large populations of hartebeest, kob, topi, buffalo, elephants, giraffes, and lions. South Sudan's forest reserves also provided habitat for bongo, giant forest hogs, Red River hogs, forest elephants, chimpanzees, and forest monkeys. Surveys begun in 2005 by WCS in partnership with the semi-autonomous government of Southern Sudan revealed that significant, though diminished wildlife populations still exist, and that, astonishingly, the huge migration of 1.3 million antelopes in the southeast is substantially intact. Habitats in the country include grasslands, high-altitude plateaus and escarpments, wooded and grassy savannas, floodplains, and wetlands. Associated wildlife species include the endemic white-eared kob and Nile lequi, as well as elephants, giraffes, common eland, giant eland, oryx, lions, African wild dogs, Cape buffalo, and topi, locally called tien. Little is known about the white-eared kob and tien, both types of antelope, whose magnificent migrations were legendary before the Civil War. The Boma Jonglei landscape region encompasses Boma National Park, broad pasture lands and floodplains, Bandingilo National Park, and the Sud, a vast area of swamp and seasonally flooded grasslands that includes the Zirif Wildlife Reserve. Little is known of the fungi of South Sudan. A list of fungi in Sudan was prepared by S.H. Tar and published by the then Commonwealth Mycological Institute, Kew, Surrey, UK, in 1955. The list, of 383 species in 175 genera, included all fungi observed within the then boundaries of the country. Many of those records relate to what is now South Sudan. Most of the species recorded were associated with diseases of crops. The true number of species of fungi in South Sudan is probably much higher. In 2006, President Kiir announced that his government would do everything possible to protect and propagate South Sudanese fauna and flora, and seek to reduce the effects of wildfires, waste dumping, and water pollution. The environment is threatened by the development of the economy and infrastructure. The country had a 2019 Forest Landscape Integrity Index mean score of 9.45/10, ranking it fourth globally out of 172 countries. Several ecoregions extend across South Sudan, the East Sudanese savanna, northern Congolian forest, savanna mosaic, Saharan flooded grasslands, Sud, Sahelian acacia savanna, East African montane forests, and the northern acacia, commiphora bushlands and thickets. Thank you for watching this video.